Hello everyone, my name is Takuyi, and let's talk about a dumb event in history. So that time a Russian fleet sailed around the entire world and destroyed itself. But first, I think we need to talk a little bit about the whole background to all of this. Okay, so back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, things got a little tense between the Russians and the Japanese. So both of these powers were seeking to expand their empires into Manchuria and Korea, which was putting their shoulders in rubbing distance, so to speak. And both of these powers had something they felt had to be proved to the other. Kind of like that new kid on the playground that gets made fun of regularly by the others. And one day, the two of them will snap, attack each other, and prove to the rest that they were not to be trifled with. So, let's go ahead and talk about the contenders here. In 1904, Russia was a backwards country, both objectively and more specifically in the eyes of Europe. In terms of geographical area, it was the largest nation in the world, and the Tsar ruled over an empire which spanned from Eastern Europe all the way into Asia and touching the Pacific Ocean. The empire incorporated many different races and cultures that were only held together by the iron rule of the Tsar. These people didn't necessarily get along with one another very well. Now, on paper, Russia was a major military power that could call up huge armies. But in reality, her armies were poorly equipped and trained, and as a naval power, she was third-rate at best, despite expanding the size of her navy to rival that of other European powers. Russian power was certainly overestimated by other countries due to its size and also the Eurocentric beliefs of its neighbors. Japan, on the other hand, was a newly emerged state risen out of the ashes of the old Tokugawa shogunate. This transformation had begun in 1868 with the restoration of the Meiji Emperor. The reforms of that era had been carried through with such dramatic speed that within a quarter of a century, Japan was ready to assert itself against China. With a modernized army and navy, the Japanese soon launched an invasion into Korea, defeating the Chinese and the Koreans spectacularly and bumping them right up against the Russians to the north. Over the next decade, this would drive tensions up between the two powers. So intense did this get that in 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur, which is now in modern-day China, without a formal declaration of war. 2 Russian battleships and a cruiser were sunk, and Admiral Yevgeny Aleskiev was viceroy and first commander-in-chief of the Russian forces in East Asia. Now, Aleskiev, though he was a favorite of the Tsar, was not exactly the best leader. After the initial losses, he gave the demoralizing order that the Navy was not to risk proceeding to sea. You know, the very thing that navies were supposed to do. In August, an attempted breakout by the Russians resulted in a second defeat at the Battle of Yellow Sea. The surviving Russian ships were now either contained in Port Arthur or in other friendly ports. Ironically, the Russians actually had the forces necessary to equal the Japanese at this stage in the war in this theater. But due to inept leaders and poor decisions, they let themselves be divided and easily blockaded. In reply to the decisive defeat of the Russian Far Eastern Fleet, Tsar Nicholas II decided that 45 ships from the Russian Baltic Fleet, which is here, would sail 18,000 miles around the world from its bases in Northern Europe to here. Once there, they would defeat the Japanese Navy and relieve Port Arthur, thus bringing about a swift end to the war, as Japan did rely heavily on her navy in order to support her land forces. However, this idealized view of events was not exactly what would happen. The epic journey of this fleet would play out like a poorly written sitcom, if not for the fact that 4,000 Russian naval personnel died as a result. From the beginning, though, this thing seemed to be doomed to failure. Because of its sheer size and the way that it touched separate bodies of water, Russian naval activity was split into 3 different areas of operation. The Far East with the Pacific Ocean, the Baltic in Northern Europe, and the Black Sea above the Mediterranean. Now, Russian naval operations in the Black Sea were restricted under several international treaties dating back to the Crimean War, which hindered the development of Russian naval ambitions. After all, this war did not go well for them, and it greatly restricted them in their naval capacity. This theater was the only area in which Russia could hope to secure ports in warm water, with access to the seas throughout the year, but the numbers and size of the ships which Russia could station in the area was limited, along with what duties they were allowed to perform while stationed there. This meant that any ships needed to reinforce the Far Eastern Fleet would have to come from the Baltic Sea on the other side of the world. The Baltic Fleet's task of completing an 18,000-mile voyage was a hard one, to say the least. This is because the fleet would need to resupply and refuel en route. Unlike the Royal Navy or the British, the Russians had no bases around the globe from which they could either resupply or recuperate. In addition to this, international treaties prevented them from using the ports of other friendly nations, such as France. No, this was going to have to be a one-way continuous journey. Hence, a plan to resupply the fleet was devised. What they would do is they would secure freighters that would in turn be chartered from the German Hamburg-America line, who would refuel the ships at sea. But what about the ships themselves? Well, potentially, the Baltic Fleet was a large and powerful force, or at least that is what it was supposed to be. In 1904, the leading naval powers were Britain, France, and Germany. The emerging naval powers at the time were Japan, whose highly disciplined Navy and officer corps had been trained by the British, as well as the United States. In contrast, the Russian Navy faced many different issues. So prior to the launch of the HMS Dreadnought of the British, many ships of the day were a weird mixture of different experiments in naval architecture. I say experiment because these were mostly untried in combat conditions, as navies were being built up to outclass other powers in a kind of arms race. This often resulted in ships being top-heavy, as the latest innovations were added to the superstructure, causing vessels to become unstable. For example, the French Navy was the worst affected by this period of experimentation and had already lost several ships which had keeled over and sank due to design faults. The Baltic Fleet suffered similar problems, with some of its battleships being as much as 1,500 tons overweight. But that couldn't be so bad, right? I mean, after all, they could still float, so maybe the extra gear would be useful. Well, in practice, this meant that the secondary armament was often under the waterline and could not be fired. Wet guns covered in seawater are not exactly a good thing. The belt armor was also now below the waterline and therefore offered no protection against enemy shells. After all, the enemy's guns could now wreak havoc across the top of the deck on its crew and equipment. An example of this can be seen in one of the fleet's battleships, the Oriole, which sank on its own while anchored in Kronstadt Harbor, and it had to be refloated. And that is just the ships. The crews of Russia's navy were another story entirely. The majority of Russian naval recruits were uneducated peasants and did not come from the coastal areas of Russia. Many of these had simply been drafted into service or volunteered in an effort to escape their lives. After all, Russia's most populated cities were inland rather than on the freezing coastlines that you couldn't access the majority of the year. Consequently, the majority lacked any experience of the sea, or on any kind of large body of water, to be honest. The Baltic Fleet spent long periods of the year inactive as Russia's northern harbors were iced up for months at a time, and this resulted in limited time being available for training crews in the finer details of modern naval warfare. These crew issues were so bad that there's a quote by one officer on the battleship the Knyaz Suvorov regarding his men. One half have to be taught everything because they know nothing. The other half because they have forgotten everything. But if they do remember anything, then it is obsolete. To make things worse, it would later come to light that some of the men on these ships were actually members of various revolutionary groups who were trying to stir up unrest among the crews by making things worse than they had to be. Russia at this point was fostering many dissidents at home, like the communists, which are their own story entirely. In addition to this, Admiral Rostovinsky was also dissatisfied with his senior officers. He referred to his obese second-in-command Rear Admiral Folkersham as a manure sack, and described the cruiser commander Rear Admiral Enquist as a vast empty space. Next time, we will begin the journey of this fleet. Thank you for watching. Please like and comment below and let me know what you think. I understand that this is a bit of a new style that I am trying here, so if there are any criticisms, anything that you would like to say, anything that you want to see in the next video, please do let me know. The next one is where things get pretty memey.